My name is Tara Stevens. I'm in the Cognitive and Behavioral Ecology program at Memorial University in Newfoundland. If you guys aren't familiar with the area, I'll show a map a little later on. I also do some work with the marine mammal section at Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, in St. John's as well. So my talk is titled Northwest Atlantic Killer Whales, Studying Whales in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. So first, a little bit about myself. I was born in Maine. I was born in Belfast, so I'm only 25 years old. A lot of people call me young, I guess. I grew up in Troy, Maine, which I guess at least one other COA alum has been from Troy, Maine, so that's kind of interesting. I was valedictorian of my graduating high school class, and after that moved straight to New York City to go to NYU. They didn't really have my field of choice at NYU. So as Sean said, I came here, did a summer course, and then transferred in and ended up staying here. My interest in whales was sparked by fieldwork at Mount Desert Rock. It was an experience completely unlike anything I've ever done before, so it was very exciting, and I just kept doing it. I learned to sail in the Caribbean on tall ships. I took one of Sean and John's class where we went down to learn how to sail. And then followed that up with the Semester at Sea program, which to any of you who thought about it, I highly recommend it. It's a really great program. After that, I moved to St. John's, Newfoundland around 2006, 2007. I did a couple internships for COA. In the middle of that, kind of moving around a bit, worked in BC for a while, and then back to Newfoundland, then back here, then back to Newfoundland, so it kind of jumped around. But all along doing most of my research with Dr. Jack Lawson, who's a research scientist at Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. I've worked with some well-known marine mammal researchers across North America. Dr. John Ford in British Columbia, he's like the killer whale specialist. Dr. Hal Whitehead at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, he's the sperm whale guy. And Dave Mellinger at Oregon State University, he also works at NOAA out there and is doing a lot of new and interesting stuff about acoustics. So I've gained a lot of different perspectives and different research abilities from different people that I've traveled around with. And part of that's from COA enabled me kind of to be able to build up my study and meet different people in different formats. So officially I started my PhD in May 2008 at Memorial University, short is MUN, in the Cognitive and Behavioral Ecology program, and my thesis is on the Northwest Atlantic killer whale population. So I'm looking at abundance, distribution, behavior, etc. And we'll go on to more detail a little later. So, if you don't know where Newfoundland and Labrador is, there's a map of North America, and I'm pretty sure before I came to COA I didn't know that Newfoundland existed. But this island right there is Newfoundland. So zoom in a little bit closer, and St. John's is right there. It's basically the furthest city east on the North American continent. And just for a little comparison stats here, I found kind of interesting. So Newfoundland and Labrador, which there's Newfoundland and Labrador, contains this whole big chunk up here too. Area is about 156,453 square miles. Population in 2010 for that whole area was 509,000 people. In Maine, the area is much, much smaller, 35,000 square miles, and the population is over 1 million. So think about squishing a lot of people, or spreading out a lot of people across Newfoundland and Labrador, where the population density is quite low. Capital city is St. John's. That's where I live and do my research out of. And the metropolitan population for that area is about 187,000, whereas Portland is, a few times that size. So it's a pretty small city. And there are things that are great about it and things that I certainly miss from New York City, but still there for now, at least. Okay, now. So why am I there? I originally went up there to do an internship with Jack looking at killer whales. Basically, people come up to me and say, really, there are killer whales in Newfoundland? Or there are killer whales in the Atlantic? And I have to say, yes, actually there are. And the reason why nobody knows about them is they're very poorly studied. Nobody's studied them before. But Newfoundland in particular has a really unique bathymetric properties around it that enable a lot of upwelling and a lot of diversity and productivity in the ocean for a lot of different marine mammal species and a lot of different fish. And so the area is really abundant with animals. Just it's really hard to research them there. So just a little map of the area. Here's the Grand Banks, so that's well known for the fisheries. The big cod fishery that was out there in the moratorium after the cod stocks collapsed. Flemish Cap out here, it's all highly productive regions, lots and lots of potential food for different mammal species and fish species. And then just looking at the currents, so this white current that's coming down here, that's the Labrador current. That's cold water coming up and is really nutrient rich coming down past Newfoundland and Labrador, and then it mixes with the Gulf Stream that's coming up from the south, and this creates a boundary that kind of traps smaller animals, plankton, krill, and stuff like that. That makes very productive regions, especially offshore, but inshore there's lots of whales and stuff to look at. So, about whales. There's about 26 species of cetaceans in the Northwest Atlantic. This includes down towards this area too. So for baleen whale species, we've got blue whale, fin whale, sei whale, bowhead whale, which is more northern than really down near St. John's where I'm at. Right whales, humpback whales, minke whales, lots of minke whales. This past summer we actually had a right whale that was in a bay just like 20 minutes south of St. John's. And they were able to photograph it and ID it as one that hadn't been seen for I don't know how many years. So that was quite interesting. Odontocete species, which are toothed whales, which includes sperm whales, killer whales, which is my study species. A lot of beaked whales that are predominantly around the outside and in the gullies and stuff where they dive really deeply. And just a bunch of different types of dolphins and harbor porpoise. So really there's a lot of marine mammal species around Newfoundland and Labrador, making it a good place to go study whales if you want to research whales. And basically wherever you look, there's whales. And if you look at this, the pattern, this is all whale species plotted on a map of Newfoundland and Labrador, of the Northwest Atlantic, ranging back from like the 1700s from whaling records until now. And you see that there's a pattern that looks very similar to the bathymetry. And really the reason for that is there's a lot of fishing effort along the edge of the banks, so that's where our sightings are coming from. And so there are sightings beyond that, but we just don't get them because nobody's going out there to fish or they're not telling us about sightings. Anyway, my study species is killer whale. Latin name is Ursinus orca. That painting right there actually was done by my mom, sitting right there. So, there's again. General anatomy and facts, that's pretty basic. Most of you probably know this, but there's the eye patch, and the eye is right below it. Dorsal fin. On males, it can be 6 feet tall. Females have shorter dorsal fin and it's curved, so you can, if it's an adult, you can tell the difference of the species at sea. The saddle patch, which is really useful for photo identification because there's marks and scratches and scars all through it. The fluke there, and then the pectoral fin. So average length maximums, male killer whales can get up to 32 feet long. And when you think about it, our boat that we go out in, a Zodiac, it's about 25 feet long. So when we're out there and photographing and biopsying killer whales, and we have males swimming alongside, they're really longer than our boat actually. And it's quite startling when you look down and see this giant killer whale right beside you, right beside your inflatable boat. Females are a little bit smaller. They're the largest member of the dolphin family. And like I said before, with the dorsal fin and just the size difference, there's considerable dimorphism. Adult weight is, a male can get up to 22,000 pounds, females 16,000 pounds maybe. Those are pretty big whales. Longevity, killer whales actually live pretty long. A female can live up to 90 years, but estimated that the average for a female is about 50 and average for male is about 30, so they're relatively long-lived species. in terms of breeding, females reach sexual maturity around 15 to 18 feet in length, maybe about 5 years old, something like that. Gestation lasts for 15 to 18 months, and calves are weaned after a year. They drink milk for at least a year, so they're weaned between 1 and 2 years. And then depending on the social structure of the group that they're in or the type of killer whale that they are, calves may stay with their mothers for their entire life, or they may split off and go away. I'll describe a little bit of that later on. And they're one of the only cosmopolitan species, whale species. They're found everywhere. They're seen in ice packs chasing after seals and minke whales that are trying to hide underneath the ice. And they're also seen in the tropics and in really warm waters, so they're everywhere. So the early days of killer whale research. Killer whale research really began in the 1970s by Michael Biggs in British Columbia. He was like the pioneer of killer whale research. So him and his team went out, started to look at killer whales and noticed that you can identify individuals based on nicks in the dorsal fin and scars in the saddle patch. And that if you take a photograph of that, that becomes a photo identification for that particular animal. And if you recite him later, take the same photograph, you can kind of catalog where this whale has been and when he's been where. So that became the first cataloging effort. And just out of chance, they noticed that most of their photographs were of the left side of the whale, so that became the normal. They just said, okay, well, we have most left side, so we'll say left side dorsal fin saddle patch area is used as a standard ID photo. And this is now a worldwide standard. Us in Newfoundland and Labrador, we take photographs, we try to take photographs of the left side if we can get them. People in Norway, the Antarctic, they all use left sides, which is useful if you're looking at movement in between areas. Unlikely that a killer whale in the Atlantic will be seen in the Pacific, but it's possible that a killer whale in the Western Atlantic can be seen in the Eastern Atlantic, so it's still useful. Then they realized that over continuous years of doing the same research and taking pictures of these animals, that they could track movement patterns, and then by observing behavioral trends, it led to the classification of resident and transient killer whales. And that's usually what everybody comes to me and asks, are there resident and transient killer whales in Newfoundland? And I have to say, well, I don't know. So basically what a resident killer whale is a fish-eating killer whale. And transients are marine mammal hunters. They don't interact generally. They're sympatric, so they're overlapping in distribution, but they don't interact really. They don't breed together or anything like that. So, and their behavior is completely different. Their social structure is completely different. So it's really interesting that they found this out so early on with killer whales out there, and it's always been the question for other people studying killer whales in different areas. Is there the same resident versus transient population going on everywhere? And so, as I said before, killer whale research was pioneered by Michael Biggs, now led on by Dr. John Ford and Graham Ellis, their colleagues, and there's a ton of people out in BC, up and down the coastline, and in the northwest U.S., and there's tons of people looking at killer whales now out there. And that's spreading worldwide. So here's a photograph of a killer whale that we shot on, I think this past summer actually, and it's basically a photo ID catalog image that we use. So when we get animals that have scars or nicks and scars in the dorsal fin, that's really good because they're really easy to identify. But it seems like a lot of killer whales in Newfoundland have clean dorsal fins, so it's really hard to tell them apart. There's a lot of nicks and scars in the saddle patch itself. The shape of the saddle patch can be used to identify individuals, but the direction of the animal and the aspect of the camera versus the animal changes what the shape looks like, so you kind of have to process this all in your head. And so there's no actual program that I can put all my photos in, press play, and it'll go through and make matches for me, which would be wonderful, but there isn't anything like that. And then there are a lot of other features on a photograph that aren't really there, like that little dot right there, that's reflection from the sun. So that white spot isn't actually on the killer whale. And so as you're going through these photos, you have to kind of look at the light conditions and where there's shadows, where there's glare and stuff like that. And so it gets kind of difficult, especially in the Atlantic. In the Pacific, it seems like they have much better weather and flat, calm seas and nice sunny days, so you get the perfect photographs. But out in the Atlantic, it's a little bit harder. So, studied populations. The thickness of the circles, which you can kind of tell, relates to about how well they've been studied. So BC, obviously, and Southeast Alaska, down to California, very well studied, very well understood. So they're leading the way, really. Norway is another area that they've been really well studied in the past. Recently, it seems, though, that the killer whales have changed their distribution following their prey offshore, so it's been harder for Norwegian researchers to actually get out and to find the whales to continue their research. There's been a little bit of research around Iceland, some starting in the Canadian Arctic, as well as around the UK. Some interesting stuff going on in the Russian Kamchatka Peninsula area. Some research, a little bit of research around New Zealand, and quite a lot more now research around Antarctica. And it's really it's interesting because all these populations, they are completely allopatric. They don't overlap in distribution. And so looking at behavioral trends, comparing them to other populations is something that I'm very interested in. And there's a big gap in the Atlantic, so that's where I'm trying to put my circle around. So, Northwest Atlantic killer whales, lack of studies. There's been no dedicated studies until I came to Newfoundland in 2006 and said, let's go look at killer whales. All previous assessments were classified as data deficient, meaning there just wasn't enough data on them. They were too hard to study. They couldn't find them. Didn't have the resources to be able to find them. So now we're trying to kind of reverse that trend and get some money so that we're able to continue to do our research. At DFO, our research interests are distribution. We want to know where they're located, population size and abundance, and so that's really what DFO is interested in, the top two, and a couple of other on the bottom. I am more interested in the behavior, so looking at their movement patterns, feeding behavior, social behavior, and association patterns. So what individual killer whales are associating with each other. Their acoustic behavior, so what sounds are they making, and do they repeat these sounds over and over? And then, because all of my funding is from DFO, I do have to look at impacts on other species. So are they predating too much on cod, and is that causing there to be less cod in the ocean now, and is that going to harm Newfoundland fishermen who want to be fishing cod? So it's all it's interesting, and DFO wants to know these things. And what risks are there to the population? My ultimate goal is to compare our population to these worldwide populations. And obviously, this is a much greater undertaking for a single PhD. I've been told many times that I'm very ambitious, and I have my mind set way too high with many, many more goals than I could possibly get. But anything basically from this is just the start of our research program on killer whales. Anything that we can find out about killer whales will be new and exciting, and we can use that to compare to other populations. So it's very interesting anyway. And it can be carried on by students beyond me or however that may go. So one of the most basic resources that I use is our sightings database, which is a database of sightings of killer whales around Newfoundland and Labrador. So you got date, location, how many animals are in the group, what they were doing, maybe. So then I plot this all with GIS and look at the map. And currently we have over 700 sightings since the mid-1700s. Those the early sightings are from whaling records. Whaling captains would sometimes jot down in their notebooks that killer whales would come and harass the boats and take chunks off the fin whales that the whalers were killing and stuff like that. So we get at least a location or an estimate of a location for where killer whales were in historic times. nearly all of the sightings are non-effort based, meaning there hasn't been a systematic survey looking particularly for killer whales. In 2007, there was an aerial survey that did the entire coast of Newfoundland, Labrador, Gulf of St. Lawrence, and even down towards the U.S. and Scotian Shelf here. And it was they just saw a handful of killer whales. So really the abundance is too low that you can't really do a systematic survey. We have to rely on other people that are out on their boat, see killer whales, and send us their data. So basically, looking at this map, where there are boats, there are killer whales. We get a lot of reports every year of killer whales. And I go out and talk to fishermen and say, have you ever seen killer whales? And they say, yeah, sure, I saw killer whales back 10 years ago, and he came up and bit the fish off my hook and swam away, and just funny stories like that. So they're out there. We just have to have better means of finding them and getting to them so that I can do my cataloging work. My analysis for distribution is broken down into 4 areas. Labrador, which is this section. Newfoundland, which encompasses all of this side of Newfoundland. The Gulf of St. Lawrence, which is that area there. And then the last area is the Scotian Shelf, which is that shelf right there south of Nova Scotia, and the northeast U.S. So this plot right here shows all sightings since whaling times that are reliable, and there seems to be a lot of hot spots around, but yeah, here's a better plot of the hot spots. The hot spots look like, are actually where there's a lot of effort, so it doesn't mean that that is definitely an abundant, an area where you can go and definitely find killer whales. It's not. It's where people are looking, there's the killer whales. So based on our photographic catalog, which has, now I think it has about close to 100 individuals, we're estimating that in the Northwest Atlantic, so that encompasses this whole area, there to be plus or minus 200 individuals, which is a pretty substantial population size considering in all of BC, I think there's less than 200 now. They have a pretty good, I think with residents, yeah, there's probably less than 200 now, not including Alaska and down to the south in California. And most of these sightings tend to be around Newfoundland and Labrador, or around Newfoundland. Less effort up in Labrador, obviously, but the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Scotian Shelf and the Bay of Fundy and Gulf of Maine have really high effort. Lots of people out on the water all the time. There's a lot of aerial surveys for all of these areas. They rarely see killer whales, so it seems like Newfoundland is, at least in terms of the general scale of the area, a pretty good place to find killer whales. So really this 200 individuals is what I tell people. Everybody asks me how many killer whales are there, and I say about a couple hundred. It's really a best guess because our discovery curve for finding new individuals in the photographic catalog is increasing exponentially. We're currently constantly finding new individuals and lots of young calves and juvenile whales, and there are very few reports of dead whales, which might seem like there's not any dead killer whales, but given the vastness of Newfoundland, Labrador, and the fact that a dead whale can just float away and nobody would ever know, it's not as applicable. So it's impossible to determine a population trend. There's no historical abundance to compare to. Nobody's ever done a survey before. And right now we even don't know what the current population size is, so we can't tell if it's going up and down. And some people have made assumptions that the killer whale population is increasing, but this could be a function of increasing public awareness. Because I've been out, and Jack has been out, and other people have been out saying, we need to get killer whale sightings for you. Can you send me your killer whale photographs, and can you send me any sighting information you have? So more people around the area know about our research, and so they're sending in sightings, they're looking for killer whales. So this can create a false impression that the population size is actually increasing. But that said, like I said before, in the Gulf of Maine and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, there are definitely less sightings than there used to be. And so could that mean a population shift. We don't really know what's happened in these areas. In the Gulf of Maine, at least, they used to feed predominantly on tuna, and a lot of tuna fishermen would report killer whale sightings when they're out fishing. Less and less of that is occurring, as I assume the tuna population is being depleted. So these killer whales are having to maybe move or change their feeding behavior, so they're not as seen as much. Don't know yet. And kind of obvious, but we can't measure abundance with non-effort-based data. So that's one of the things that I'll probably not have for my thesis, and DFO will want, but they can't have it, is an abundance amount. I can tell you where they go. I can't tell you where they don't go, though. And I can tell you how many we think there are, but I can't tell you that there's this many per square kilometer of ocean. So the next thing that I was interested in is movement patterns of killer whales around Newfoundland and Labrador. And from our photo ID catalog, we have resites from different areas. And so I was wondering, well, what are the movement patterns? How do they move? Where do they move? And why are they moving? So by re-identifying individuals, this tells us where they've been, but it doesn't tell us where they have been, where they have not been, or where they were in between. So, for example, I photographed, or one of our colleagues in Saint-Pierre-Miquelon, which is French Islands on the south coast of Newfoundland, photographed a pair of killer whales that later, I think a couple weeks later, were seen in Bonavista. A couple weeks later, were seen on the north coast. A few days later, seen in St. Anthony, and then up in Battle Harbor. So it looks like they went this way around. But we also have sightings that start in Saint-Pierre and then are later seen a couple months later in Battle Harbor. And we really don't know if they've gone this way around, or if they've gone that way around, or if they go offshore, and then we don't know where they are in between. But at least this is giving us some information about where they're moving. And the fact that we're seeing these trends over years is getting more interesting. The longer I'm doing this, we start to see a pattern of the same whales going to the same areas and returning to the same areas. So that to me is very interesting. Right, individuals and groups are capable of moving long distances over short periods of time. I think the record was a couple weeks from Saint-Pierre all the way up to Battle Harbor. And that's a pretty long swim. But also we've seen killer whales that just stick around an area for several weeks at a time. So in terms of resident versus transient, in terms of movement, we can't tell if there's any, if they are resident or if they are transient type animals. And also there's no evidence of a seasonal migration pattern. I've plotted all of our sightings or portions of our sightings over each month, and they've been seen everywhere during every month. But winter data is data deficient, so that might not be the best way to do it. So what about in between times? A lot of researchers now are starting to look at satellite tagging. It's becoming more affordable, more people are using it. And so we decided that we want to satellite tag killer whales. So we bought 5 of these Spot 5 tags from Wildlife Computers. A lot of people studying killer whales are using them on the West Coast, and they've had great success. They've used them in Antarctica, and they've had great success with them. And also in the Canadian Arctic have had good success with them. So we bought 5 of them. This past season, 2010, didn't get a single one out, so that was kind of a bummer and unsuccessful. So hopefully next season we'll have better luck at it. But they're interesting tags because they're so small. They're only location recording or only location transmissions. So it's not recording depth or anything like that, so you don't have to have a big package and a lot of batteries to put on. So that right there is the satellite tag on a killer whale. So it's really small and unintrusive. These are titanium barbs that go into the whale about 5 centimeters. And after a while, they'll kind of be squeezed out, but they seem to last anywhere from days to months. And hopefully with this, we can get some in-between times and see where killer whales are on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour time scale. this is something I know John was very interested in, the feeding behavior. The most asked question that I get, aside from are there killer whales in the Atlantic, is what do Newfoundland killer whales eat? And there's two answers. Easy answer is not quite sure yet. Complicated answer is kind of long. We know they eat minke whales, white-beaked dolphins, harbor porpoise, seals, maybe some fish species. But we do not know if there's a differentiation between fish-eating and mammal-eating killer whales like there is in the Pacific. We don't know if, for example, we don't know if killer whale A is eating mammal and then later on switches to eat fish. We don't know if they really like white-beaked dolphins versus harbor porpoise. We just don't have enough data to look at what their preferences might be. But it seems like minke whales so far appear to be a major prey item for Newfoundland killer whales. And part of that might be to do with the fact that minke whales are pretty big. They're about the same size as a killer whale. They breathe air, so they're at the surface. The attack happens at the surface. And there's a lot of swimming, a lot of thrashing, a lot of water spraying up in the air. And so this attracts the attention of people that go out in their boats to look at what's happening. And they say, wow, killer whales are killing a minke whale, and they send us this data. With a harbor porpoise being a much smaller animal, they can take it in one bite, kill the thing, eat it, and it's gone, and we don't know about it. And the same goes with fish. Fish school under the water, so we don't know unless a killer whale comes up with a fish in its mouth. We cannot say for certain that that killer whale is eating fish, even if there's fish in the area. So we've gotten conflicting reports of people saying killer whales seem to be eating capelin, which is a small fish kind of like herring, but there's also minke whales in the area, and there's birds in the area, so some people are assuming that they're eating birds even, and we say, well, maybe they eat birds, but we can't be certain unless we actually see them consume and swallow that animal, that it's a type of prey type. And like I said before, tuna used to be an important prey type for Gulf of Maine killer whales, but as the tuna fishery is going downwards, there are less sightings of killer whales, and I don't know what they're eating now. There seem to be fewer sightings of killer whales, so maybe they've all moved offshore for something else, I don't know. But anyway, killer whales feed on a wide range of animals. That is a recovered dorsal fin of a white-beaked dolphin. For some reason, it seems like they leave the dorsal fins. We have a lot of dorsal fins in our freezer. So I don't know why, but they don't like it. That killer whale there is chasing a white-beaked dolphin. I know somebody here is looking at scarring on humpback whales. So we know at least that killer whales are at some point in the life stage of a humpback whale harassing and chasing humpback whales and getting close enough to actually bite their flippers and flukes and dorsal fins. That one's a pretty fresh one. This is an interesting aerial photograph. You can see a bunch of killer whales there and 2 or 3 right whales. And that kind of freaked out the right whale guys. He said, uh-oh, there's only 295 right whales, I think, left. But I don't think they killed any of them. This one's a male killer whale. He's harassing a juvenile killer whale, and the mom, or a juvenile humpback, and the mom is off somewhere else too. But the people who were photographing this said they didn't actually kill it. I've got a lot of those reports where they say killer whales chased a juvenile humpback for a while and tried to get close to it, but then just gave up and went away. So it seems to be the bigger the animal, obviously, the harder it is for them to kill it. And humpbacks have a unique fighting mechanism to combat killer whales. There's a paper on it by John Ford, actually, that proposes that the barnacles and everything on humpback whales is used as a fighting mechanism against killer whale predation. That's the dorsal fin of a harbor porpoise. These are the tips of a fluke of a fin whale, actually, and this is from a long time ago, during whaling times, when they were taking fin whales. But at least it looks like killer whales got near that one. And that's another humpback with rake marks on his dorsal fin, but he's still alive. So another one of my questions was, what's the group structure and social organization of killer whales? So basically what I'm doing is looking at a lot of different aspects of killer whale behavior and ecology, and trying to find at least something that I can write a thesis on. And it seems to be going okay for now. Group sizes range from 2 to 20 individuals. The average is about 5. The average range is about 2 to 6 individuals. And that kind of corresponds with the group sizes of transient killer whales, marine mammal-eating killer whales in the Pacific, which, when you add that to the fact that they're eating lots of minke whales, makes you really want to say that there are transient killer whales in the Atlantic, but not enough data yet to confirm that. Lone male killer whales are not uncommon. We have many sightings of just a single male out cruising along by himself. And that's also common with transient killer whales in the Pacific. And in general, group size and composition within and between years seems to be very fluid. This chart right here, which it doesn't matter if you can't read the numbers, it just shows how different individuals have interacted over years. So let's say NF0007 has been seen with NF0010 3 times and has been seen with all these other ones a couple times. It's not always seen with the same individuals, but it's a very complex kind of interaction and fluidity that's really hard for us to analyze because it's so complex and just, they're always with new whales and you don't know what kind of association patterns there really are. Given that, we have seen a handful of pairs of whales that seem to stay together for years. So this one right here, this male and this female have been seen together on several occasions over at least 5 years. So that's interesting. And here they are, and that's a little white-beaked dolphin in between them that later became lunch, which I thought was a cute photograph there, but I don't think they photographed it being chumped. And it's interesting, the size difference is just amazing. Like you think of killer whales, their size, they're just big animals, and then this tiny little white-beaked dolphin really shows off how big a killer whale is. Something that I've been working on for a really long time now, for the past several months only, has been acoustics. Acoustics is an up-and-coming field in marine mammal biology. A lot of people are starting to use pop-up buoys from Cornell. Some of you might be familiar with those. Again, the vocal behavior of killer whales is being increasingly studied because more people have access to acoustic recorders. They're becoming more affordable. And this was pioneered by researchers, of course, in British Columbia. So they always kind of are a bit ahead of everybody else, it seems. There are 2 main ways to obtain underwater recordings. One is monitored, so you're out in your boat, you have your hydrophone, you dip it over the side, and you record sound. The other way is autonomous, and that means you have a recorder with a bunch of batteries and a hard drive in it, and you put it out. It goes to the bottom, you have flotation attached to it, and it stays there for months. And then you get it back, and you get lots of data back, hopefully. So we use both of these. We have handheld ones that we deploy from our boat. So far, I haven't gotten any killer whale recordings from that, partly because killer whales move a lot, and we're following the killer whales, and so there's a lot of boat noise, and it's just really hard to get killer whale recordings when Jack and I, my supervisor, and I are the only 2 people with this group of killer whales. So we've done a lot of autonomous recordings actually, and right now I think we're up to 8 separate recorders that we have around Newfoundland and Labrador, and each of these record for about 6 months, depending on the time of year, for about 20 minutes every hour. So you can imagine when you get all these recorders back, and we try to redeploy them with fresh batteries, fresh hard drive, to get continuous sampling. 20 minutes every hour for 6 months multiplied by 8, and then multiplied by however many deployments we have. That's a lot of data. And so that means that no student, no single student, no team of students could possibly go through it by hand and look for sounds. So automated methods have been developed. There's some issues with some. There's some that are better than others. I'm still trying to figure out which is the best way to do it. But I've yet to find killer whale vocalizations on these autonomous recorders. Fingers are still crossed. I have a bunch of hard drives sitting on my desk that need to be processed yet. So there's potential. And this is what it basically looks like when you get back your recorder and you plug it into your computer. You see a spectrogram image. Along this axis is frequency, and this is time on the bottom. And so it mostly looks just gray, and that's ambient sound. But if you see down at the bottom, there's these two little blips. Those actually, when you zoom in, they're say whale calls. So at least we're picking up some animals. But generally, it's just hours and hours and hours of blank data, or a lot of ship noise, or surf noise, or something else, not killer whales. But we do know a little bit about killer whale acoustics. Again, like I said, BC pioneered all the research for killer whale acoustics. In the Northeast Pacific, transients, the marine mammal hunters, are silent until a kill is initiated. That's because they're hunting marine mammals that can hear them, and so they gotta be stealthy and silent until they actually initiate an attack, and then they can talk and kind of coordinate their behavior. Residents, the fish eaters, are constantly making sounds. So their acoustic repertoire is well documented. They have repeated calls that are passed down through generations of killer whales even. And so something that I would love to find out is if something similar is going on here. And if I can't find out by just behavioral observations if there's marine mammal hunters versus transient or fish-eating killer whales, maybe acoustics can help me to understand that a little bit better. If they're always silent, maybe that means something to them. So far, I have 2 good recordings for killer whales in the Northwest Atlantic. They were recorded by Dr. Hal Whitehead out of Dalhousie University when he worked in Newfoundland in 1982 and 1983. And these are offshore on the Grand Banks. They're really great recordings considering the fact that they're recorded before I was born. And he also made behavioral observations and recorded it in conjunction with the acoustic recording, so you can, and he's describing an attack on humpbacks by the killer whales. So you can actually listen to him talking and saying, okay, the killer whales are approaching the humpback, and the humpback is thrashing his tail, and you can see what vocalizations are happening as this is going on. And it's a really, really actually valuable resource that I have, because you can hear, obviously the killer whales are making all of these sounds, but you can also hear humpback groans and humpback thrashes and squeals and all kinds of stuff, and it's quite interesting actually. It's actually hours of data. This, actually, how do I get sound? Yes.
Should say external audio.
That's echolocation right there. So they're echolocating on something. It could be the hydrogen itself, it sounds like. then all through these recordings, there are a few different repeated calls throughout, which I find very interesting. And not that I think I could find the same calls today. I have no idea if I could, but it would be really interesting if I did find the same sort of repeated calls in recordings that we make today. But anyway, killer whale acoustics is actually very complex. I spent about 3 months working with John Ford doing some of his offshore killer whale recordings, and it's just tedious work because you're listening to these sounds and trying to categorize different call shapes into different calls, and they kind of slowly morph into different shapes, and you don't know if shape A and shape B are the same or if they're not. So it's actually very tedious and difficult to do. So, continued Northwest Atlantic killer whale research. As part of my thesis, I don't know how far along these I can get, but we would like to learn the potential impacts on other marine mammal and fish species. Is there a potential impact on minke whales? I think of this question because minke whales right now at least seem to be a major prey item for killer whales. So if they're constantly taking minke whales, and this past summer we had, I think, about 8 separate accounts of minke whales being killed by killer whales, what is that going to do to the minke whale population? Could it change it, or has this been going on forever? We'd like to understand the risks to the killer whale population. This includes contaminants. Killer whales are an apex predator, so through biomagnification, basically they are full of contaminants. At least every population studied have a lot of contaminants in their blubber, and this is passed on from a female to her offspring and can lead to health problems and all kinds of stuff. So we have biopsy samples of a few killer whales, and one thing that we want to look at is contaminant levels to compare to other regions. Habitat degradation. This includes acoustic disturbances from shipping and fishing and oil and gas industries. Newfoundland and Labrador, they're finding more and more gas and oil underneath the Grand Banks. So there are constantly seismic surveys, which are basically seismic ships send out loud pulses of sound that go down through the bedrock to find oil, basically bounce back, and they can tell if there's oil under the surface or not. They're doing a lot of these surveys around Newfoundland and Labrador, and it's incredibly disturbing to animals that use sound to communicate and to swim and to basically if sound is a big part of the social aspect of killer whale societies, then disturbing it so much with fishing and seismic and everything, what does that do to killer whales in this region? Another thing is changing sea conditions. So the ocean is definitely getting warmer, and there's definitely less sea ice. Some people have proposed, and I don't know how much I agree with them yet, that less sea ice means that more killer whales are moving further north. But that goes back to the same thing, that more people are aware of looking for killer whales, and there's really no data yet to support it, even though actual papers have been published on it. So changing sea conditions, more applicable really up in Labrador where there's sea ice that comes down. But what could that do to the killer whale population if there's less ice? And then what I really want to do is compare compare the Northwest Atlantic population to worldwide populations, comparing their behavior and social structure and acoustic behavior and everything like that. This includes BC, Russia, New Zealand, Antarctica, Norway, the UK, Iceland, Canadian Arctic, all of these separate populations. So one question I ask is, should allopatric populations, so separate populations, of killer whales be considered different species? And people are asking this question also of sympatric populations, so overlapping populations, such as transients and residents that overlap in distribution, should they actually be a different species because of their such strong differences in their behavior? I don't know how I agree with that either, but looking at or adding the Northwest Atlantic population and their behavior and ecology to the list of other areas that are being studied and comparing the behavior. Maybe we can come to a better consensus on what a species of killer whales is. And another question, do allopatric populations exhibit divergent social and behavioral ecology? So are killer whales in the Northwest or the Northeast Pacific have the residents and transients, so there's two very different behavioral types. Is this the same in the Antarctic, where there are actually 3 different types that have 3 different behavioral trends? Will we find this in the Atlantic? And some other questions that I just threw out there. Is there an inshore offshore population? The offshore population, if there is one, we definitely have killer whales from the offshore, but we don't know if they're interacting with the inshore animals. So what kind of differentiation is there around Newfoundland and Labrador? And what is the range of killer whales? Do they migrate? Do they swim between regions? Meaning, are they going from Newfoundland up to the Arctic, down to the US, out to Iceland? Where are they going? And if so, what risks might they encounter? Because different countries have different laws regarding marine mammals and what you can do to them and potentially how many of them you can be killing. So they might be encountering different risks. And generally, if I send off my photographs to people working in Norway and they say, yeah, actually we get these killer whales coming over here, that could have potential impacts on our population in Newfoundland.
Right ahead, above you.
So I'm just gonna mute that because there's a lot of chatter between Jack and I. Jack is driving the boat. This is this past summer and shows a typical Newfoundland day. Cloudy, very windy and wavy and bumpy and kind of hard to really do anything. But we have a group of killer whales here. I think there were 5 of them and they had just killed a dolphin. And so we're trying to get biopsies of them. You can see me holding a crossbow. And the killer whales are kind of being hard to shoot because they're doing all kinds of funny things. And I did get 2 of them though. I'm a really good shot.
Tara, have you thought about using the biopsies for trophic ecology?
Yes. Yeah. Not discussed here, but yeah.
In that case, did someone call the sighting in and then?
Yeah, actually, this was a tour boat was out. They saw the killer whales. We were just out earlier that day and had just got back into shore, drove across town back to the office, got a message on the phone that said, there are killer whales out here. We go, oh no. So we had to drive all the way back across town, go out and look for the killer whales that we happened to miss earlier and found them luckily enough. But it's just Jack and I on the boat, and I took it out, but there's one point where I'm holding the crossbow and the camera at the same time, trying to take photographs of them, of their left sides that are clear and usable, and also trying to take biopsy samples. And I didn't have a third hand to throw the hydrophone over either, so. But they were very interested in the boat. They come up very close. Yeah, that, I don't know if that showed that very well. I just shot that killer whale, got the biopsy, but it broke the arrow in half. So we got the sample though. So that sample we stick into DMSO, put it in the freezer, and that'll be sent off, well, once we get more, sent off to have some analysis done. But it's very interesting. They come really close, and there's one point, the second shot that I got, hit a whale, the arrow was floating in the surface, and then there was a killer whale coming up right underneath, so I held my hands out of the water until the killer whale swam away, and then I reached in and grabbed the arrow out of the water. You never know. But they've come close enough to the boat where I've thought, I could just reach out and grab his fin, but then being in an inflatable boat and killer whales with very sharp teeth, thought better of that. So, that's all about killer whales. Now for something different. This is St. John's. There's St. John's, the harbor. Looks nice facing that way. Probably facing the other way, there's lots of white caps and fog and everything else out there. So This is Signal Hill, which is a major tourist attraction. I don't know if anybody who's been to Newfoundland aside from Sean, but really good view from up there. And then just some other pictures. It's very unique landscape. It's a lot of rock and not many trees and lots of small brush and stuff and lichen and little trees and stuff. That says Dublin 3,289 kilometers that way, and London's that way, and Paris is that way. Just little touristy things that the first summer I was out there taking pictures of everything, and now it's just, sure. That's the Narrows, that's leading into the harbor. And I always like this photograph because it looks like from the Monty Python, it looks like Camelot. Every time I see Signal Hill, I think Camelot. And some whales. Pilot whales, they're very cute to look at. They were making lots and lots of sounds. We can actually hear it from in the air, their vocalizations, little chips and squeaks and whistles and everything else. This photograph here, I worked for a while with Wayne Ledwell, who does whale disentanglement. A whale is getting caught in fishing gear. It's a really big problem in Newfoundland, or it used to be a much bigger problem, declining now. But we were about 100 miles offshore trying to free this humpback whale from gear, and basically he held me over the side of the boat, and I looked under to see where the rope was attached to the whale so that we can cut it free. And he was attached to crab gear, which is very heavy, and he just couldn't move. So we freed him, but don't know if he lived or died. Some other pretty humpback pics. This is us in a boat that we don't use anymore because it's a terrible boat, but there's a killer whale right beside us, and you can see the size of the animal. He's a big male. This is a fin whale, and I'm taking a biopsy of him. Another thing that I do is some aerial surveys where I go out in airplanes and look for whales, and that's a lot of fun. That's Jack, that's my supervisor. That's one of the biopsies of the killer whales, so we always aim for that spot. To get the satellite tags on, we'll use a crossbow as well, but because you need the tag to be out of the water for a little bit of time for it to actually receive or transmit to a satellite. Higher up is always better, so it's going to be a trick to get a satellite tag on a killer whale that high up on a dorsal fin. Lots of icebergs up there. Last year there weren't any, but this one was gorgeous. It just broke as we were driving out to it, and just crackling all like that. This is up in Labrador near Battle Harbor, where some of you might be familiar with, and the shoals up there, and big swell coming in, and you wouldn't know that there's a shoal there except for the breaking waves. This is the jaw of a killer whale that was stranded probably 15 years ago now. And so we've taken teeth out for sizing and sampling and stuff like that. And more pretty shots of humpbacks and fin whales and white-beaked dolphins and another fin whale and biopsy of him. And this was this past summer, actually. We did an aerial survey with our colleagues in St. Pierre-Miquelon. And so basically what we look like is this. We just look out the window and look for whales for hours on end. And it's incredibly painful. And when you don't see whales, incredibly boring. But at the end, you get to drive the plane or fly the plane, so that was kind of cool. And this little thing down here is a screenshot of MATLAB, which I'm using to analyze my acoustic data, and you basically have to have a programmer's mind to be able to use that program. And I spent weeks with people out in Oregon trying to teach me the very basics of it. And finally, I got it, or I got that one at least, and saved the screenshot so I would remember what to do for the next time.
It's nice to see you get the same red error messages that we do on that.
Yeah, those come up a lot, actually. And that's it. Thank you.
Tara does have to get home, but we do have time for some questions if anyone wants to ask questions.
From what you found so far in the research that I don't know, did you say like 3 or 4 years that you've been starting?
We started we started in 2006, did about 3 weeks of work, and that was it. So 2007, 8, 9, and 10. So about 4 years of kind of better work.
Yeah. Have you found that, like, for the studies on population dynamics and group studies and stuff, is possible, or that it's limited of what you're able to research or find out?
The problem is with a PhD that's supposed to last 4 or 5 years, it's kind of limited. The guys in BC have been doing this for 40 years, so they know what size population they have because they've been doing it for so long and have so much field and photographic data and sightings data. Within my time up there, might be stretching it a bit.
But, like, after that, it's possible?
It's possible, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's difficult, especially in Newfoundland, because killer whales are so sporadic and we can't just go out and find them like you can in some other areas. Usually we're out there working with fin whales and humpbacks, and if we get a call about killer whales, then we'll go try to find them. But generally we can't just go out, and there's a lot of killer whales seen offshore and we can't get to them. So we might be able to determine a population size for inshore areas maybe, something like that.
Is it the DFO that funds most of the research?
Yeah, all of my research is funded by DFO, which is good because they, at least right now, have some money. Don't know about it in the next few years, but it's very expensive work, actually. The autonomous recorders that we have are about, with the mooring and everything, about $20,000 each. So I wouldn't be able to get my own funding probably for the 8 that we have. And boat time, and boats are very expensive, and all that stuff. Go ahead.
You may have said it and I missed it. I'm sorry. What is the frequency range on their vocalizations?
Around 4 to 6 kilohertz. Yeah, they're kind of similar to pilot whales, but if you study it long enough, like I think I'm at the point where now I could say that's definitely pilot whales and not killer whales, or vice versa. But it takes a bit of experience and knowing what to look for, because they do overlap in frequency with other animals.
Do you see right whales at all?
We have 2 recorders actually that were off on the edge of the Grand Banks, and people that know some things about acoustics and know some things about right whales said to me, I bet you have right whales on those recorders. And I have those 2 sitting on my desk waiting to be analyzed, because doubtful that we have killer whales, but a lot of people seem to think I'll get right whale sounds on those, and that means big bucks coming into us if we have right whales in Newfoundland waters. But generally, right whales in Newfoundland, very rare. Go ahead.
I read an account of a fellow who watched orca or killer whale feeding behavior in the Gulf of Maine with minke whales, where they bit off the tongue and let the whale bleed out, and then like bit off a piece of skin and then sort of like unwound the skin like an orange peel. Have you ever seen that?
I've heard. No, actually. I've seen or I've heard of that with seals in BC. They'll kind of unwrap a seal inside out, and yeah, it's kind of disturbing actually. A lot of the accounts of killer whales attacking minke whales, at least in our region in Icelandic waters, is what they try to do is drown the whale. So they'll keep trying to jump on top of it, cover its blowhole, and push it down in the water. So basically drowning it, and then they have other killer whales ramming it from beneath, so then eventually it bleeds to death or drowns to death, one way or the other. So it's very disturbing actually, but very intriguing how they do it, because their behavior and their intellect to be able to do this is amazing for an animal. Go ahead.
Do you check back and forth with like the Icelandic catalog to see if there's overlap if they're moving from the West
We
Coast?
haven't yet, mainly because I'm well behind in my photographic analysis. But that's one of the things that we want to do is compare with Iceland and Norway, and potentially the Azores actually. It seems to be a nice population there only in the wintertime. And we see few killer whales in the wintertime, so it could be interesting. John?
Tara, I have to ask you see these guys are causing problem, right?
Yep.
Why are you going to some of the worst waters in the world looking at killer whales in the tropics. This is a huge hole in data.
I know.
What's wrong with you?
I don't know. I've wondered that many times when I'm out there in my floater suit, freezing to death, with water coming over, and we're soaked with ice cold North Atlantic
Could be
water.
76 degrees.
I know. Exactly. In a bathing suit, doing my studies. Mainly because even though the population density in Newfoundland is pretty low, much lower in the Caribbean. So, more likely that I'll see them in Newfoundland.
Is it
Yeah.
possible to do any of the photos ID from land, or because you said you had to find different holding
Yeah.
the camera and the
Yeah, we do have some. I do have some photographs actually from people that are standing on land because they do come in right close to shore. But generally, you have to have a pretty well-equipped camera to be able to photograph killer whales because they're so quick. Like a standard, digital camera has that delay, and you'll never get good photographs with one of those. But we do have some from land.
Tara? Sorry.
Sorry. How difficult was it for you as an American to get an internship in Newfoundland?
The internship part was fine because I was not paid, unfortunately. So if you go into Canada, I went in as a visitor. If you go into Canada saying you're not getting paid, which I wasn't, they don't really care. They asked me every possible way that they could. Are you working? Do you have a job? Are you getting paid? Are they giving you money? I said no to all those questions, and then so they let me in. Right now I'm there on a study permit, so I have X amount of years on my study permit left to finish my research, and then they'll kick me out of Canada after 6 months that it expires, but I can reapply. So it's doable. And definitely if you're getting paid there though, much harder to get in because there's all kinds of stuff where they have to find out if there's another Canadian that could potentially be doing the same job as you, and why are you taking an American to do the same thing, and so it's kind of a hassle. I'm sure it's even worse the other way around though.
If you're taking a job from a Canadian that could potentially be paid and you're still volunteering, then that's still a problem. So,
Yeah.
My question to you would be this: why is GFO funding killer whale research? And is depredation still an issue with these animals? I know up in Labrador they were talking about some depredation issues.
DFO was funding it. They were funded under SARA, which is Species at Risk, the first 2 years of my study. At that point, they made an assessment and unfortunately classified them as data deficient. And that's the worst possible scenario because contrary to any logic, data deficient means you get no SARA money, no species at risk money. You would think that since there's no data, we need to find out the status and risk to this population, so let's give them money to analyze the population. But it's the complete reverse logic. They say, nope, data deficient, you don't get any money. So most of my funds are coming through on blue whales and other stuff that, like all the recorders were bought under blue whale money. And so we're looking for blue whale vocalizations too, but I'm stealing the data and looking for killer whales.
So it sounds like in your PhD and as a scientist, you've got like a lot of hats that you wear and you have a lot of different things you have to do to
Yeah.
get this picture. What would you say is the number one task you do?
That's a good question. The number one task probably is the photo. I think the photographic work that we're doing has the most potential to answer as many questions that I want to answer, because you can cover a lot of different things, association behavior, stuff like that. It's uncertain if we'll get enough biopsy samples to actually do a real analysis, because you need at least like 25 to do any type of isotope or fatty acid analysis or contaminants or anything like that. And for the past 4 years, we have 3 samples. So, and acoustics has great potential, but it's like a needle in a haystack where you drop a recorder over the side. You don't know if there's killer whales going to be swimming around because they are relatively high frequency, so their vocalizations don't travel that far, so they have to actually be very close to that one point where you put that recorder. So that maybe not have the best potential. So I think the photographs definitely. And we're getting a lot of people on board with us that are sending us data, sending us photographs. There's tons of people out on the water in their own boats, and everybody has a digital camera now. So we're getting lots of data that way.